Welcome to our When Lightning Strikes online series of interviews. When Lightning Strikes, the Unsexy Side of Awakening is a feature film about what happens when you wake up to realities different than you have always known and how do you integrate that process. And we've decided to take our show online in light of the coronavirus. And we have our first guest today is David Harshada Wagner. He is a yoga teacher and an author and a spiritual teacher. And David, do you want to say a little bit about who you are and what brings you to our show?
Hi, everyone. Yes, as a teacher of especially the inner practices of yoga, so meditation and spiritual awakening and that aspect of spiritual evolution, the whole topic of spiritual awakening, Kundalini awakening, all of this kind of thing is super interesting to me. And I love the approach that this project is taking. So I'm always really happy to talk about it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So do you want to tell our guests a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So I work with people in a variety of different ways. I lead retreats. I do online courses. The main thing that I'm focused on these days is doing in-depth mentoring. I hesitate to say coaching because it's such an overused word, but one-on-one, long-term kind of spiritual midwifery with people. To really, meet with them and help them to move through the process of awakening and integration and really train people to put their spirituality, the fruits of their spirituality and their wisdom into their daily life and kind of help them through that whole process. That's the main thing that I do these days. And I'm a dad also, so that occupies a lot of my bandwidth as well.
Thanks so much for talking with us, David. We really enjoyed speaking with you when we were interviewing you in Ojai for our film, and it's great to reconnect and talk to you a little bit about awakening here in this setting. So for those of us who may not understand what we're talking about when we use this colloquial term awakening, how would you describe it? How do you understand it? What's a way that we can help people recognize what it is we're really talking about?
Yeah, it's one of these words, right, that is overused and maybe underutilized or something. So I mean, it's a word, awakening. It's a broad word. It can mean everything from just, when we wake up in the morning and get out of bed. But when we talk about spiritual awakening, it usually refers to the dawning of spiritual knowledge. And not just head knowledge, but inner knowledge. In the Sanskrit, the yoga language, there's this word jnanam, which means knowledge, and then vijnanam, which means wisdom. So there's knowledge and then there's wisdom. And usually when we talk about awakening in the spiritual context, we're talking about the dawning of that. And that can happen really gradually, or that can happen very suddenly. Sometimes the inner part of it awakens before the knowledge even is there to give it context. And I think that's a lot of, what the idea of the unsexy side, in this project is about oftentimes.
So so with that said, maybe you would like to share a little about what's unsexy about awakening. We don't usually hear that. I think we're usually associating it with a lot of optimism and love and light and positive joy. So some people might be surprised to hear it's unsexy. Other people might feel validated by it. So tell us what that means to you.
Yeah, well, there's different sides to that answer in our day and age of spiritual training and spiritual experimentation and the industry of spirituality, because it's sort of like the exotic pet industry or something, where it can be easier or harder to obtain, a crocodile or a tiger or something. But then once you have that crocodile or you have that tiger, then you have to know how to take care of it. And then you have to take care of it well, or else it's going to be harmful, not just for the tiger or the crocodile, but for society potentially. So there's both an internal and an external aspect of what you could call the unsexy thing, because the internal part of it is either it's not something that we signed up for in the first place, and that happens. And that happens sometimes when people are doing spiritual practices. It happens these days a lot of times when people are taking drugs and plant medicine, where all of a sudden there's this awakening of their Kundalini or awakening of their spiritual intelligence, but they just thought that they were, going to a music festival. They didn't sign up for spiritual awakening. So then all of a sudden this process begins. And that's the thing, is that for us to awaken spiritually, we have to leave behind the ways in which we're asleep spiritually. Just like you wake up in the morning, you're not completely awake. You get out of bed, you're rubbing your eyes, you walk to the coffee pot, it takes some time to become fully awake. And that process for humans on the spiritual path is usually years, sometimes it's decades. And that process can be painful, partly because when there's like a partial awakening, that can cause all kinds of different hazards that I can talk about. But then also just the purification process itself, as it's known, where, those aspects of us that were unconscious are now being brought to the conscious level. Those create all kinds of pain and suffering. And the main thing is that most people these days are going through this process in a very unsupervised, sort of uncontrolled environment.
Yeah.
And traditionally it was never like that. And nowadays people can just go online and they can click on something and enter into some path of awakening.
Mm-hmm.
And they may or may not be ready for it. They may or may not have the kind of tools and support that they need at all.
Yeah.
So all of that, it could go on and on.
Right. No, I think that's perfect. And that's what we're trying to highlight, is that there are legitimate tools and support out there for people, people who are really doing the work in an organized way. I think one of the things that Kate and I often talk about that's so important in this journey is people maintaining their own power. We call the film When Lightning Strikes because so many people refer to their own experience as lightning striking, right? It's a sudden, sometimes physical, energetic sensation, like Kate describes. For some, it's a more metaphorical use of when lightning strikes, because nothing is the same ever again, or it's this aha moment of realization. So I wonder if there's something that you could advise people for when lightning strikes them. What would you like them to know?
Yeah, I think that, when it's a situation like that, where it's something that they weren't really looking for, because there are a lot of people that really are looking for it, and it's, it should also just be said that it's a beautiful process, and it's a life-saving process, and a huge healing process, for the vast majority of people. But for the people who aren't looking for it, and it kind of happens in that way, the main thing is to know that they need not do it alone, to reach out for support. And, these days that support is available, but also know that these days there's lots of wolves in sheep's clothing available too. So that's another part of the puzzle in our day and age. Because, if it happened back in the 1950s in the Western world, someone would just go to a psychiatrist and the psychiatrist would just give them some diagnosis. Now they could go to a psychiatrist, they could go to a psychologist, they could go to a chiropractor, they could go to a guru, they could go to a shaman, they could go to a yoga teacher, they could, you know, so many different things. And while the support is essential and they will be able to find some support, they're probably going to have to do some sifting before they find really good support.
How would you suggest, like, how would a person know when they found the real deal? Like, what kind of a guiding system should they use to determine who's actually legitimate and can be helpful on the path?
Yeah, that is such a tough question.
No.
It's really, I mean, in this day and age, it's really such a tough question. And I think that, you know, unfortunately, oftentimes it's a process of trial and error. It's a scientific process. And, you know, to also know that there are different levels of support that we can take. And like one level of support is like professional support, like reaching out to someone like me or someone who knows how to work with people, but then also to have peer support, you know, that people that like know you and love you and believe in you and that can give you some of that feedback sometimes too. And ideal thing is if you have other people that are also going through the experience. That's the ideal thing, of course. But that's, yeah. And then it's really a scientific process, because the thing is that nowadays, all of the people that are the potential helpers are also entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
So everyone is going to say that they know. No one's going to say, I'm curious, I'm not sure. That's probably a good way to know, is if the person says, I'm not sure, but let's try this. That's probably better than someone who says, oh yes, well, this is what you need. You just need to, you know, smoke mugwort and, you know, wear an aluminum foil hat to bed. Or, you know, some like exact remedy or something. That's probably a sign that they don't actually know what they're talking about.
David, I love that you said that so much, because I think that's one of the things that, you know, you really resonate with me personally as a teacher, because you empower people in that way. I think it's so important to be in that discernment process through your awakening. And often people are taken advantage of because they're vulnerable as they're going through this opening, because they're shedding all of their protective systems. So I'm glad you bring that up. I think that's really important. And that's one of the things that we want to highlight in this film and through our courses that we're going to be offering.
So you are a teacher of Kundalini yoga, but not in the Yogi Bhajan lineage.
No.
Can you say a little bit about that distinction?
Yeah. So nowadays, most people, when they hear Kundalini yoga, they associate it with the brand of yoga that is started by this person, Yogi Bhajan, who's now in the news a lot and has kind of been revealed as, I don't think that his thing probably was a completely innocent thing, as I was describing before. It seemed like there was actually some charlatan kind of things there, including in the way that those techniques were derived and the origin stories that he tells about them compared to the actual origin stories of those techniques and teachings historically. The word Kundalini is a universal word, and the teachers that I was trained by come from lineages that recognize the Kundalini awakening as a central part of the spiritual path, but not something that we like aggressively mess with. It's like that awakening happens almost mostly contagiously through transmission and just being around each other. And then as that energy is awakening, then the practices that we do of meditation or chanting or body work or whatever that we do, that is all there to sort of like help that process to unfold. But we don't get in there and try to poke it or mess with it or flame it up, or, you know, it's just recognizing, like with some reverence, that it's really powerful, and to approach it with that sense of reverence, really.
Yeah. So having a Kundalini awakening can look a number of different ways. So people go to yoga and they try to awaken this energy, but it can also happen spontaneously and turn someone's life as it did mine, completely upside down. And so can you share with us, like, what are some of the symptoms that could look like? Or you've seen in your experience that might see?
Yeah, there sometimes just in anyone, it can just be like a lot of energy, a lot more energy than they're used to having move through their body and move through their being. Sometimes that energy can, because energy is energy, and so it will look for an expression. So it will go through like paths of least resistance. So it might go through our sexuality, and people will become hypersexual. It could move through our mind and our mental kind of thing, and then we can become hyper mental, and it can really feel like a kind of an insanity, or emotional, or physical. It can just feel like a humming energy in the body that is just like more energy than we want, or that feels good. The other thing that's important to say is that sometimes that energy will exploit like little fissures or like little fractures in our psyche. So like if someone has an underlying condition, especially a psychiatric condition, sometimes that can exploit it. I'm thinking of one person that I've worked with for many, many years, and she started coming when she was quite young. And she would have these extreme reactions where she would become very ungrounded and stop eating, and then really start to get less and less grounded, less and less in touch with kind of reality. And then it turned out that her mother had a paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis. And so, and eventually this person also ended up going to just a regular psychiatrist, and was on some antipsychotic meds for a little while, but kept doing practice and kept like working with it. And eventually she didn't need to be on the antipsychotics anymore. This is all under her doctor's supervision. And it all kind of stabilized for her. But that process took almost 6 years, 7 years. And still to this day, she's very sensitive. She's incredibly sensitive to any kind of spiritual energy at all. And unless she approaches, so she comes to like a retreat with me, or she comes to like a spiritual gathering or something like that, she has to be really mindful and make sure that she's eating well, that she's grounded in general, and and know when it's time to say, okay, that's enough. I need to go lay down. I need to go eat a grilled cheese sandwich and just chill out. Yeah. But it has taken her now, she's been at it for 10 years, 12 years. And she has found a really beautiful symbiotic relationship with it.
Beautiful. I think that's important, that piece about like medication, because there's so many ways that this can manifest for people, and to not throw like to not just, to be open to really whatever the solution may be. And at some point it might be medication, some point it might be not meditating, some point it might be, more meditating. It's just different for everybody. And it also changes over time. It evolves. And so to constantly monitoring it and seeing what do I need now and now and now. Yeah. It sounds like she had a beautiful journey through, lucky that she had your guidance to go through it with.
I feel lucky to have her in the community. Yeah.
Awesome. Katrina, do you have any other questions?
No, I think that's great. I think it's great that you brought up the mental health piece, because I think that's a lot of questions that people are confronted with. Distorted reality and this whole idea of, is this the same as mental illness? Is this different? And I think, the answer is, again, it's individual for every person, and you should absolutely seek out consultations with doctors, as well as practice going into your intuition and recognizing and discerning what you need, what's impacting you. Is it the energy of a room? How can you tend to yourself so that, there's nothing black and white here, I don't think, but certainly we don't want people to throw this away as psychotic break, but we also want to just respect that people have different experiences based on their unique circumstances.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you a question about how that process relates to addiction, David. I think
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I myself am a recovering person. I have been for the duration of my spiritual journey. And I work with a lot of people in recovery. And I also live in Southern California, where I see what appears to me to be a lot of people who use Kundalini energy as a get high thing. And maybe they're addicts that are untreated, and because you can do some of these practices and get very high and get into an escapist sort of experience relatively easily without any drugs. And that was kind of the whole premise behind the Kundalini yoga thing that happened in the 60s with Yogi Bhajan. But what I see is that, you know, when that happens, people's underlying addiction is not getting dealt with. And in some cases, it's getting worse. I've seen that happen so many times. And so I would just say that if somebody is an addict, to deal with that addiction, I always tell this to people that I work with, you have to deal with the addiction first before you get into the spiritual awakening journey. And then to make sure that there are ideas about what it means to be sober, to be, you know, whether your addiction is a sex addiction or a drug addiction, and to make sure that you're on track with that, you're on track with your actual recovery. Even if you're using this sort of like really juicy spirituality to help you with your connection with a higher power, that's great. And it does accelerate the healing, and that's great. But to make sure that you're paying attention that you're actually healing and not just, you know, you didn't just find a new way to get high.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. Yeah. I think that's true of any sort of shadow work also, is to incorporate that into the spiritual practice. I relate to that. I was so good at going like out into outer space and expanding that I didn't have to deal with any of my darker stuff because it just felt so good to do the other thing. But then, you know, after the lightning experience, all that came up and it's forced me to process it. So yeah, I think that's a really important point that you're making. Well, thank you for all of that, David. It was super interesting. We always love chatting with you. Is there anything you want to leave our audience with at all?
No, I just think that it's worth it. Like the inner work that we do and the spiritual journeying that we do, it's really worth it. And we're being shown that more and more every day.
Awesome. And maybe for the people who are really struggling, like with the Kundalini awakening or some other kind of awakening, who are feeling lost and hopeless and like life is just never going to be the same, something for them to feel hopeful.
Yeah. Well, this too shall pass. And, you know, you're not alone. And if you go into your heart deeper and deeper, you'll find a place where you will know that this too shall pass, and also know that on that deepest level, you are safe.
Beautiful. Thank you. We'll talk to you again very soon.
Great. And we should go for a 6-foot distance walk.
Oh, yeah. Like my dog's leash length of my dog's leash.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thanks so much, David. Be well.
Much love.
Bye.
Ciao for now.